All right, so we just finished up Hardy-Weinberg in class, and before we get to selection and this poll that you should have done before this, I'm going to review some Hardy-Weinberg concepts with you just to recap that, kind of seal it up. You know that if you have any questions about Hardy-Weinberg still, or if you were absent for one of those days, you may want to email me, and I need to give you some help with that. But anyway, okay. So to recap some Hardy-Weinberg. Try to make this fit here. Okay. It's kind of like we're in class, you know? You see me, I have a whiteboard. I just don't have a bazillion whiteboards that I can slide back and forth. Okay, so Hardy-Weinberg, just the main points of it. If our population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, that means that our population is not evolving, okay? And that's what we use in experiments as the null hypothesis. It's kind of like the baseline. So we can calculate genotypes, calculate alleles in a population, and if they are not changing from one generation to the next, over however many generations you're trying to study, then that population is not in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And that population is not evolving, which means that would support the null hypothesis. Okay, and that would be, again, if your chi-square, because we tied it all in with our Teddy Graham experiment, we tied it in with the chi-square, and if your chi-square was not under a p-value of 0.05, that would mean that we are still in our null hypothesis if we are not under that number in our chi-square analysis. Now, we would be supporting the alternate hypothesis for experiments if we did have a p-value under 0.05, meaning that the change in our population, a change in the population alleles, genotypes, was not just due to random chance alone. So if it's not due to random chance, that means that we are not in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which means we can conclude that our population is evolving. We don't know how it's evolving or what's causing it to evolve or in what way it's evolving, but we do know that our allele frequencies are changing from the generations that we're studying, which means, and it is statistically backed, so statistically we are not in equilibrium. So our population is evolving, which would be our alternate hypothesis. So you always have your null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. Hardy-Weinberg not being in equilibrium would be our alternate hypothesis. So if you were studying like the Teddy Graham experiment, I gave you, in the last thing we did, I gave you one part of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium to take out of the equation. Some of you had a small population, some of you had natural selection occurring in yours, some of you had selective mating occurring. No matter what I set up for your particular group, you should have gotten for the last one, ideally, I know some of you guys did not, which is fine, but you would have ended up not in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which means your population is evolving, and it was because you were not meeting that Hardy-Weinberg criteria. One of your criteria I took away. Okay. So if your population is evolving, what you don't know is why. So one question you may want to follow up with if you did have an experiment would be, is evolution, if evolution is occurring, if we support that with our Hardy-Weinberg experiment over generations, is it natural selection? What's occurring in this population? In order for it to be natural selection, you have to have a few things, and we touched on this a little bit. and it touches on it in the book and in your active reading guides. But you have to have some type of phenotypic variation. Okay, you got to have some kind of variation in your traits. And remember when we looked at the rock pocket mouse population, our big trait variation we were looking at was light fur and dark fur. Phenotypes, those phenotypes had to be genetically inherited, meaning for the rock pocket mouse, their fur color was a genetic trait. You guys looked at the genome, the actual genetic sequences of each of those genes and figured out exactly what the genetic difference was between those phenotypes. But we know that they were genetically inherited, and you have to have a trait that's able to be passed on from one generation to the next in order for natural selection to be occurring in that population. And you have to have that one phenotype that you're looking at, in particular, our rock pocket mouse with the light and dark. It must give one of those traits an advantage, and one must be at a disadvantage, which would lead to differential reproductive success. So, for example, you have a dark environment and you have that dark mouse. Well, that dark mouse has a selective advantage, it has a reproductive advantage, meaning it's less likely to get caught by a hawk or some other predator because it is camouflaged, and meaning it has more opportunities to reproduce because it's less likely to be killed. So more opportunity to reproduce. So that phenotype in that particular environment had led to differential reproductive success. And for one environment, it may be different than the other. So if you had a lighter environment, in that case, the lighter mouse would have an advantage in that population. So it just depends on the environment. But these are the things you have to have in order for it to be natural selection occurring in that population. So, which is realistic in pretty much all populations in the wild, to be honest with you. You're going to have some type of natural selection occurring, and you just have to back it up with data. Okay, so natural selection leads to natural selection leads to adaptation. So it means that population is able to, over time, adapt to their environment. So if that mouse in the lava area with that dark environment, over time, we saw those mice were almost all dark, meaning that population was adapting to that environment. Individuals do not adapt, whole populations adapt. So think of adaptation, think of that whole population of lava mice being dark, because that is how adaptation occurs. It does not occur on an individual basis, on a population basis. And this may lead to, over generations and generations of time, this would have to happen for a long time, but it may lead to speciation, meaning the dark mouse could, over time, become a different species than the light mouse if over time they became so different that they could no longer reproduce together. Okay, so we're talking about over a long period of time, and they would have to be reproductively isolated in some way. Okay, so we're going to talk about in some of the ways that you can get speciation from natural selection, which is what your POGIL went over. Okay, so again, if you haven't done the POGIL, I would pause this, do it, and then come back to the rest of the video, because at this point on, we're going to discuss the POGIL specifically. Okay, so starting here, we're going to take a look at these graphs and just use them to help explain these concepts here. So we have directional selection is our first one. And first, notice that on all of these that you should have this in front of you. You have number of individuals on the y-axis and body size on the x-axis in each of these populations cases. Okay, so it's the same for each of these graphs. Okay, so in directional selection, and I'm not giving you the answers to these. It's pretty straightforward, but we are going to go over the more important parts, which are coming up with your definitions. So this will be on page 3. I'm going to give you some definitions like here. Okay, and we're also going to go over the term fitness. So on page 2, it discusses the term fitness with you. It brings that up for the first time, and we have not discussed that yet. What fitness is, and it gives you this definition here, which is the relative ability of an individual or population to survive, reproduce, and pass on genes. Okay, so this can refer to either individuals or a population. And basically the one that reproduces and passes on more genetic information is more fit. So if you have, in terms of evolution, so if you have, let's say one grandparent has, let's say 20 grandchildren. Okay, well that individual has made children, passed on his genes to those children, and has passed on to grandchildren 20 different times. Okay, and then you have another grandparent that's passed on that has 5 grandchildren. Okay, so they may have, no matter how many children they only have 5 grandchildren at the end. So which one is more fit? The answer would be which one has more evolutionary fitness, and it would be the grandparent that has more grandchildren, has more evolutionary fitness, because generationally, that grandparent has more individuals with his genetics passed on. So he would have higher evolutionary fitness. So that is something to think about when we are discussing these definitions. So types of selection. First, you have directional. Close this tab real quick. Okay. Directional. This is model A. So if you're looking here, directional is model A. And I know I got a little wordy with it, but it's because in the POGIL they wanted you to use all these different terms. So I'm giving you a definition in which you would use all these different terms that they wanted you to use. So directional would be individuals of one extreme phenotype that have a higher fitness in a particular environment, which causes allele frequencies to shift in one direction within a population. So allele frequencies are shifting to one extreme, because those individuals of that one extreme are having more children, they're having more offspring, they're passing on those genetics for those traits more often. So over time, over generations, you're going to have more offspring of that one particular phenotype because it gives an advantage. So looking at our model, you have directional selection. In this case, it would be selecting for, and if the original population is outlined, and the gray is population after this selection. So the population in gray from the original population is moving to higher body size, so greater body weight in grams, because this is measuring in grams for body size. So for whatever reason, it is more advantageous in this environment to have a greater body size. So you'll have more allele frequencies have been shifted in that direction. So that is directional selection. Meaning you can also say that lower body size in this case is selected, what we would call selected against. Because in this case, in this environment, it is not beneficial to have a lower body size with lower body weight. Okay? So those individuals likely die out or do not pass on offspring. They don't get mates or they die off. And that's what's happening to lower body sizes. Okay, that's directional selection. Okay. Then you have, and this is model B, you have disruptive selection. I'm trying to know there's a glare there. I'm trying to fix it. Okay. So disruptive selection, phenotypes of both extremes, so both extreme traits have a higher fitness in a particular environment. causing allele frequencies to shift in both extreme directions against the medium. Okay, so we are seeing it in both extreme directions against that medium trait. Okay. Going back to our model. Model B for disruptive selection. In this particular environment, for model B, for this population, it is advantageous to be either have a smaller body weight or a larger body weight. So that middle body weight is not ideal for whatever reason. Okay. And disruptive selection is how one big way how speciation occurs. So we will talk more about that. Keep that in mind. But there are more individuals who are surviving and reproducing on the lower body size end and on the higher body size end. And we're selecting against this middle. So this middle body weight is not advantageous. So you see those numbers have gone down drastically. So for whatever reason, this environment, that is very disadvantageous, while the other two are advantageous. And this could be, you might be wondering, what the heck, why would that be bad? Because you could see in directional selection A, you could see why higher body weight might be beneficial, because if you're a lower body weight, just like human infants, lower body weight might lead to less survivability. But disruptive, you might be thinking, why would you not want this medium body size? But think about this. So you could have higher body weight might mean more survivability in winter environments. So this higher side might be good to be bigger. There's a lot of reasons being bigger might be better, might be able to scare off predators in some instance. But if you have this lower body weight, this lower body weight on this side, you might be smaller, which means you might be able to get into small areas, which means you might be able to avoid predators. So it's not always about body size grams. You could think of in being smaller might be better for hiding. Whereas bigger, you might be able to scare off predators in some way, or you just survive more because you have a healthier body weight. And then that medium, you can't really fit in those small spaces in that particular environment. But you're also not quite big enough to scare away predators, so that might be why that would be selected against. Okay. Going back to stabilizing. This is our last one. Stabilizing selection. Sorry, this one's written kind of sloppy. Individuals with the medium average phenotype in this environment have a higher fitness. So alleles are going to shift towards the intermediate genotype-phenotype. This is kind of like the opposite of disruptive selection, because now we're selecting for the middle and against the extremes. Okay, shifting against the extremes. The medium trait has a higher fitness in this case. So going back to our model, you have stabilizing selection. Anything on the extreme in terms of body weight is bad, whereas that medium body weight is good. Okay, so two maybe on the obese side, maybe you're easier to spot by predators in this case, whereas the small guys on the other extreme just may have a low nutrition, not very healthy. So in this particular environment, in this population, we are selecting for the middle, the norms. There are a lot more individuals of this intermediate phenotype as compared to the original population. So we call this stabilizing selection. And I have a kind of funny blurb about that in its own little individual video that I'll show you. But that is stabilizing selection. All right, I'm going to have to pause this because my computer is dying. So I'm gonna have to split this in two videos just because my computer is about to die. So unfortunately, this time you're just gonna have like 4 different videos of me talking. I'll put them in order. I'll say which one's 1, which one's 2. But now we're going to get to we're going to get to natural selection, how we eventually get reproductive isolation. We're going to go to that next. Okay, so see the next video for that one. Peace.